Okay, brilliant. Let's get going. Welcome again to our webinar on the Cleantech Revolution. My name is Sam Butler-Sloss. I'm an analyst in the strategy team at RMI. Today, we're joined by my colleague, energy strategist Kingsmill Bond. He will present our annual pitch deck on the global transition, which will last about 40 minutes. And then we will turn to your questions. The material Kingsmill is presenting is published at rmi.org. The link will provide in the chat shortly. As Kingsmill presents, please add your questions to the Q&A function of Zoom, which we will turn to after the presentation. That's all from me. Kingsmill, over to you.
Okay, good morning, folks. So this is as Sam says, a webinar on our annual strategy presentation on the Cleantech Revolution. And today, and today only, we plan to run through the entire presentation, all 80 plus slides of it. So it's going to be quite quick, but we want for a change to give the entire story. As Sam says, we do welcome questions. And I should say before I plunge in, I'm just back from China, where Cleantech is booming. They hit their 2035 EV sales targets in April 2024. Their solar and wind 2030 targets will be hit this month. Data from the first 5 months implies that fossil fuel demand has peaked in electricity. So without question, in China, this revolution is exponential, disruptive, and now. So there are 7 parts to the presentation, which will give us a little bit of a structure. I'm going to have an introduction, then I'll talk about the exponential change so far, the era of peaking demand that the exponential change has created. Then I'll focus on the meat of the presentation. Why do we think rapid change will continue? Then I'll look at the implications of that continued rapid growth for the energy system, the wider implications, and then conclude with what we need to do now. And then we'll have 20 minutes at the end for some questions. Okay, so by way of introduction, there are 2 main visions of the future of energy. You have on the left the old view that fossil fuel demand will remain high until 2050 and beyond, and then the new view on the right, that exponential growth of clean tech means we will shift to a new energy system because it's cheaper and better. So this presentation is about why the view on the right is far more likely to be right, and I would say that we are the data-driven pragmatists in this debate, and the other side are the idealists seeking to prop up the status quo. So why are we so confident that the new technology narrative will win out? Well, the main point is this is the age-old battle of technologies against commodities. Technologies beat commodities because they fall in cost over time and well-established learning curves. That's why you're watching me on a small screen, not in a vast hall, and that's why humanity escaped from the Malthusian trap 200 years ago. Furthermore, technologies scale much faster than commodities. Contrast the slow growth of coal in the last century with the rapid growth of solar and wind in this century. It took coal 32 years to move from 100 to 1,000 terawatt hours of generation. It took solar 8 years. The next 1,000 terawatt hours will take 3 years. The one after will take 2 years. The one after that will take about a year. You get the picture. And the reason why is that new energy is fundamentally different to old energy. Old energy is finite, heavy, concentrated, and wasteful. It's a linear system channeling super profits to petrostates and oligarchs. New energy, however, is essentially infinite, light, universal, and efficient, and brings the prospect of cheap energy to all. Meanwhile, you should be very skeptical about the credibility of incumbent forecasters. Taking an OPEC or Exxon forecast for the future of the energy system is a bit like buying a car from a second-hand car dealer. You should be very skeptical about what they claim. So incumbent forecasters, this famous charts are showing, failed to see the exponential growth. Even those who are pretty good at it, like the new IEA, have consistently forecast linear growth in those black lines versus a world of exponential growth in reality. And in this presentation, to conclude this introductory section, we plan to focus on the 3 big levers of change that we can use in this decade. They're renewables to make electricity from the sun and wind, electrification as we use cheap electricity to electrify our systems, and efficiency as we drive massively inefficient fossil technologies out of the system. So let's kick off with the evidence for exponential growth. I'm going to look at the three key drivers, and then I'm going to look at the country story. So a lot of this is fairly well appreciated, so I'm going to scoot through it quite quickly, but just demonstrate that we have the facts that I guess at our fingertips. The key point really is to show that a lot of the hard work of the energy transition is already done. So let's start with cost. So the famous point, clean tech costs are on these learning curves. They fall by around 20% for every doubling of deployment. They've got to the level at which they can outcompete fossil fuels. Moreover, and in part as a result of that, capital has flooded into clean tech. So the IEA, for example, tells us that in 2024, it's going to be $2 trillion, which is twice as much as that going to fossil fuels. So do not fall for all the fake arguments that we don't have enough money. Capital flows to growth, as Carlota Perez showed us in her famous book. And as a result, we have seen this exponential growth in clean tech, wind and solar batteries, annual growth rates up to 68%. And solar capacity is leapfrogging every other energy source. It's about to have the largest energy capacity in the world. Batteries have grown from a standing start a decade ago to deploy more capacity than pumped hydro, which has been growing for over a century. We're already putting into place the capacity to make 1,500 gigawatts of solar and 12 terawatt hours of batteries, which, as this blue line shows, is more than is needed, for example, under the IEA net zero scenario in 2030. So the supply chain is getting in place very fast, as usual in technology transitions. Meanwhile, electrification is growing slowly but inexorably in buildings and industry for a century, and now transport has joined the party. And in fact, if you take the IASA data, electricity has become the largest supplier of useful energy. So forget all this stuff about electricity is only 20% of final energy. If you look at useful energy, which is a much more useful way of looking or understanding energy, it's already the largest supplier, making this an electric century. Okay, we're now poised to electrify the rest of the energy system as we produce the machines to use this electricity. There's exponential growth taking place in heat pumps, in EV cars, in EV trucks, in digital devices, all different ways to drive that second giant lever of electrification of the energy system. Meanwhile, the third force of efficiency is also enjoying continuous exponential growth. Not so flashy, but actually it's enormous. Over the last decade, efficiency has saved us more than 1/5 of primary energy demand. Now let's look at the story from the perspective of countries. It's immediately clear that China is the primary driver of growth, in part because China's a manufacturing powerhouse, in part because China lacks oil and gas, in part because the Chinese government made a strategic decision a decade or more ago to focus on these issues. So there has been a surge of deployment of clean tech, such as China is now responsible for around half of the deployment of clean tech and 60% of new capacity. For example, in 2023 alone, China deployed more solar and sold more electric vehicles than the US has done in 30 years, or in fact, forever, actually. So super fast growth in China is driving this change. The key difference, however, between China and the rest lies in the speed of electrification, as this chart is showing. So whilst the world has been electrifying final energy usage quite slowly, China's been electrifying at 10 percentage points every decade. As a result, it is fair to say that China has become the world's first major electrostate. Moreover, China, of course, is not alone. Exponential growth has been happening across the OECD. And most importantly, perhaps, change is also taking place in the global south. From Brazil to Vietnam, from India to Morocco, clear-sighted leaders are seizing the new technology to harvest their own sun and wind. Because no surprise, everyone wants a piece of the action, and if they can get it, they will grab it. In Asia is electrifying so quickly that it's leapfrogging the West. It's not just a story of wealthier countries like Korea, Japan, and China. Also, Vietnam and Bangladesh have leapfrogged United States and Europe in terms of electricity as a share of their final energy mix. And to conclude our rapid scoot through exponential change to justify our relatively optimistic framing, let us not forget that 2023 was a stellar year for clean tech. So I keep on hearing these stories about how the story, how things change is not happening in 2023. Look at the facts, folks. Solar panel costs halved. The price of Chinese batteries halved in 2023 to around $54 per kilowatt hour. Solar panel cost down to 11 cents. That is the primary driver and the most important thing that happened in 2023 in the energy system. And as a result of the continued rapid fall in costs, the growth in 2023, to remind ourselves, was spectacular. So if I take the IEA data, we saw 85% growth in the deployment of new solar, 60% growth in new wind, 35% growth in EV sales, a tripling in battery storage. So again, the narrative that 2023 saw a slowdown in the clean tech story is just simply empirically incorrect. Okay, the third part. Why is this exponential growth so material? And I'm going to set out now the reason why. It's because it's creating peaking demand in the fossil fuel system. And that's the theme of this section. So let's start with some basic facts. We have flashing red lights of peaking demand all across the fossil fuel system. Fossil fuel electricity capacity additions peaked in 2010. Fossil oil and gas upstream capex peaked in 2014. ICE car sales peaked in 2017. Fossil fuel demand per person peaked, or came off its plateau, in fact, in 2020. So we have very, very clear indications that something is going on. And if you then look at the individual end-use sectors, you see peaking demand taking place in sector after sector. So, for example, in the industrial sector, we've seen peak fossil fuel demand in 2014. That's been driven by the electrification of Chinese light industry, incidentally. We saw peak fossil fuels in the building sector in 2018, driven by efficiency and low population growth in the global north. We've seen peak fossil fuels in the electricity sector was highly likely to be 2023 as a result of the surge in solar and wind. More about that in a second. And then the transport peak is imminent thanks to the rise of EVs. So unquestionably, the era of peaking fossils is here. Let's talk a little bit more about the electricity story in a bit more detail. It's an absolutely classic story of the growth of the new, overwhelming low demand growth. So you see the growth of the new, of wind and solar at the bottom, just inexorably, somewhat lumpily, but inexorably rising faster and faster. And you see the kind of average global growth around 600 terawatt hours. Solar and wind this year is going to be about 800 terawatt hours. The conclusion is obvious that the growth of the new, as the IEA, many other folks are now pointing out, is sufficiently large to overwhelm the growth in electricity demand at a global level. Furthermore, the story in transport is one of EV inefficiency driving peak demand in one subsector after another. It looks like oil demand for cars peaked, according to the IEA, in 2019. It looks like road oil demand will peak this year, according to BNEF. That, incidentally, is 3/4 of the oil demand for transport. So sure, there's a bit of growth left in aviation, some growth in shipping, but the huge pieces of the system are seeing peaks as a result of the growth of this new energy technology. Then moving on to the country story. If we look at the story by country, it's all pretty clear. OECD fossil fuel demand peaked in 2007, which is over 15 years ago. Now, this comes as a bit of a surprise to the folks at the Energy Institute, who shamefully said in their recent presentation that there were signs that there might be peaking in the OECD. Guys, you're 15 years too late. In the United States, fossil fuel demand has peaked in every single major sector: electricity, transport, buildings, and industry. They've all had peaks a generation ago, thanks to efficiency and electrification. And then China. China's the pivot nation in this story. It's responsible for around 60% of the growth in fossil fuel demand since 2000. And as soon as China moves from growth to decline, the world too will shift from growth to decline, because the global south is simply not large enough to outweigh decline in both China and the OECD. So let's look a bit more at the Chinese story, the Chinese peaking story. And here again, we have very, very clear evidence of peaking fossil fuel demand right across the Chinese energy system, not coincidentally, the same as the global numbers I've just quoted. So peak fossils in the industry in 2014, peak buildings 2018, the latest data from Korea, from Lori Marie-Leverta for the first 5 months of 2024 indicates a peak in fossil fuel demand in the electricity system at the end of 2023. And then, of course, famously, Sinopec is forecasting an imminent peak in oil demand for transport. And finally, let us not forget that the global south is extremely varied. Many parts of the global south have already seen peak fossil fuel demand, from Latin America to Thailand to South Africa, because these folks, just like everyone else, like cheap, clean, local energy. And this Exxon story I keep on reading about of a global south driven fossil fuel demand growth is simply a fantasy. Okay, so to move on to the fourth section, and I guess the key point of this entire presentation, the growth has been there. You know, you look at the data accurately, you will see it. But the question really is, will change continue? So we can look at the barriers to change, which are extremely powerful and difficult, but then we'll look at the solutions too. So let me start by recognizing that change is not easy. There are, of course, barriers to change everywhere, and we've been hearing about them for decades. So first we were told 20 years ago that solar and wind didn't work, then they were too expensive, then that they couldn't handle intermittency. The latest arguments are that the price is wrong and that we cannot build grids. But look at the chart, folks. We've continuously solved these barriers with policy and technology solutions. We're highly likely to continue to do so as we bring to bear low costs, batteries, digitization, and a host of other new technologies. We don't operate in a stagnant world, thank goodness. So if I may take the luxury of a strategist to summarize this story, which is at the same time incredibly complex, but also quite simple. Think about the share of solar and wind in the electricity system as a proxy for the global story. So solar and wind are around 15% of global electricity supply. Today, leading countries and regions are around 50%. They're pushing to 80%, and they're figuring out how to get to 100%. So there are basically 3 stages in this particular transition, but it applies to the global story as well. Most countries are well below the 50% ceiling where the leaders are. So for them, it's a question of solving the political barriers to change, basically dealing with incumbent resistance to change. That's incredibly difficult, but it's not an economic and it's not a technical issue. It's clearing out the impediments of incumbents who wish to continue to make super profits and defraud the public. For the leaders, they have to figure out the economic barriers as to how to get to 80%. And then there are the other folks working out endgame problems about how to get to 100%. But the key point is that the endgame issues, the 80 to 100%, are no impediment to the energy transition today. The ceiling of the possible is far above our heads, and it just keeps rising. And the classic example of disruption taking place long before 100% disruption is the internet. We only crossed 50% global internet penetration in 2018. It's only 67% today. So with a bit of simple maths, that means that 33% do not have internet access, which is less than the 25% of fossil fuel demand that Václav Smil talks about in his latest rant, How the World Really Works. The end game does not prevent rapid and disruptive change, because of course the internet has radically reshaped the world long before we get to the final 33%. Okay, so let me look at the five key reasons why I would suggest that the solutions will continue to outweigh the many challenges and barriers which are being erected by the incumbents. So the first is technology, really. Clean tech just keeps on getting better. You know, more patents, higher battery density, more efficient solar cells, new innovations in grids and heat batteries and digitization, entrepreneurs all over the world figuring out how to use these technologies in new ways. And as a result, clean tech costs are highly likely to keep on falling So if you take very simple maths, S-curves, learning rates, you can figure out this kind of range that we've done here. Solar is, of course, famously the cheapest energy source in history. It's going to halve in price by the end of this decade. Just think how that reshapes so many industries. Just think also how it solves all of the many problems that people are currently concerned about intermittency. Meanwhile, we forecast that the global battery cost would halve by the end of this decade when we did this calculation. In reality, taking the latest data out of China, it's going to happen quicker than that. We were hoping for around $50, should we say, average by the end of the decade. We're already there, folks, in China. And don't forget, when you've got really cheap batteries, the cost of firming intermittency is just a few cents per kilowatt hour. The second big driver here is energy security. So again, just stand back for a second. Think about how many assets you have as a country. You've got your coal, your oil, your gas, your hydro, your nuclear, your solar, and your wind. And your solar and wind turns out to be 100 times bigger than all of the other stuff added up. 100 times bigger. Some countries it's 1,000 times bigger. Certain countries have a bit of an issue. It's less than 10 times. Stand up Germany and Japan. But most countries have massive supplies of clean tech. And meanwhile, only 14% of people live in countries that export fossil fuels. Only 5% live in the petrostates. So the point simply is that for most people, if you want energy security, you need to deploy clean tech and you need to get it done quickly in this fracturing world. Okay, the third point is that fossil fuels are incredibly inefficient. They waste famously 2/3 of their energy in thermodynamic losses before you even get to useful energy. This chart done by my brilliant colleague, Dan Walter, looking at all of the losses of the fossil fuel system between primary and useful energy, even before we think about losses from useful to energy services, as the great Amory Lovins has analyzed in detail. So clean tech basically is 3 times more efficient than fossils. 1 exajoule of solar replaces about 3 exajoules of coal. Heat pumps are 3 or 4 times as efficient as gas boilers. EV are about 3 times as efficient as petrol cars. And in fact, the entire fossil fuel system is incredibly fragile. We are pushing against an open door. Fossil fuels waste $4 trillion a year in efficiency losses. They kill over 5 million people from pollution. They generate 3/4 of the greenhouse gases, which are leading us all to disaster. Meanwhile, they get $1 trillion a year in subsidy and channel $2 trillion a year to petrostates and oligarchs. So you might say that never in the field of human history has so much money been made for so few at the expense of so many. Our fourth driver is Chinese leadership itself. China is the world's largest energy consumer, and they are changing fast. The dual goals of peaking before I should say 2030 and net zero by 2060 are highly likely to be beaten. So you can expect the world's largest country to just keep shooting up the S-curves. And then finally, we have the race to the top. China's basically opened the door to a new world of energy technology. And now everyone wants a piece of the action in order to drive their own growth and in order to avoid falling too far behind, in order to lead the energy technologies and the technologies of the future. So as a result, you see the IRA in the US, the Green New Deal in Europe, and innovation and policy change taking place all over the world. So this kind of FOMO is the final and I think possibly the most powerful force which is driving change and enabling people to clear away the many barriers to change which are preventing us from getting on with it. So what does all this mean? It means clean tech keeps going up the S-curves of deployment, as we've seen in many other technology shifts, cars or radios or fridges or internet or phones or canals or railways or pipelines or roads all have the same kind of S-curve shape transition. And what that means is that technologies will continue to cascade across geographies. So the share of electricity generation, to illustrate the point here, will continue to rise in leading countries, but also continue to rise in countries which are a little bit behind the curve. And we need to focus on the low-hanging fruit of change before our very eyes, not the potential endgame problems decades into the future. Moreover, technologies will also continue to cascade across sectors. So we see that happening with batteries moving from cars to truck, trucks in light industry to heavy industry electrification, from lighting to heating and buildings. These new technologies are cascading across sectors in a very, very classic manner. Okay, I think I'm doing fine for time. What are the implications of all of this for the energy? What are the implications of all this change for the energy system? Well, in technology shifts, as I mentioned already, S-curves are a better forecasting tool than expert analysis, which is quite an interesting observation. But anyway, if we apply S-curves to solar and batteries, that implies we will have more than 1,000 gigawatts of solar sales by 2030, 5 or 6,000 gigawatts of battery sales by 2030. It means that solar and wind generation will more than triple by 2030, that stationary storage will be 10 times higher. It means that EV sales will be 2/3 of car sales by 2030, and the EV domino effect will spread to light trucks and to heavy trucks in, again, a very, very classic manner. It means that electrification will pick up speed as transport joins the party, and digitization and the race to the top speed up change elsewhere. And then finally, it means, in terms of setting the scene, that efficiency will also be pulled up the S-curve by the size and the growth of clean tech. So you have on the three drivers we spoke about at the beginning, renewables, electrification, efficiency, all being changed during the course of this decade and actually reinforcing change as they work with each other. So what does that mean? In turn, it means that the COP goals are actually much more achievable than they look. So continuity up S-curves means that we will roughly triple our renewable capacity by 2030. It ain't easy, but it's the way that the world is going if our leaders don't put giant impediments in the way and continue to clear away the barriers. It means that the global electrification rate is likely to double by the end of this decade. And it also means that we are highly likely to get to 3% annual efficiency gains by the end of this decade, simply because of the mass of more efficient technologies coming into a highly inefficient system. So to go back to our original framing, we then have these three drivers and three classic X-curves: solar and wind going up the S-curve, pushing fossil fuels out of electricity; electrons going up their S-curve, pushing fossil fuel molecules out from end use; and efficiency increasing and reducing the spectacular amount of waste we have in the current system. And we have, of course, we have seen this X-shaped pattern before. This is not new to students of energy history, although it seems to be a bit of a surprise to the fossil fuel advocates. When you look at the shift from horses to cars, or sailing ships to steamships, or gas to electricity, you kind of get rapid growth of the new, a bit of a fight at the top, a bit of a plateau for the old, and then demand just collapses as the exponential of the new keeps on going. So change is hard, but innovation continues, and more efficient technology ultimately wins through, I guess, is the point of the analysis of energy history. What does that mean? It means a new energy system is coming. I illustrated here with Rystad data, but the key point is that fossil fuel demand plateau will either last until the end of this decade or the start of the 2030s. That's really what the fight is over. Can you continue to make super profits for 5 years or 10 years? The largest areas of fossil fuel demand are in fact those which are most at risk. I mention this again because of this argument that we still need a lot of fossil fuels. Of course we do, but actually for 75% of fossil fuel demand today, most electricity, most transport, most buildings, a little bit less than half of industrial demand is under the threat of rapidly rising superior clean technologies today. The hard to solve sectors are simply the end game of the energy transition. They do, of course, need to be solved. And we have folks at RMI working on the hard to solve sectors right across the park, night and day, but they are no impediment this decade to our story of disruptive change. So what does that mean? It means that fossil fuel demand will get squeezed between clean energy rising and efficiency increasing. You have an absolutely classic and entirely predictable squeeze in demand for fossil fuels taking place. And that means in turn that the fossil fuel system is on the brink of really very rapid decline. So again, fast or faster, take your pick. It's either got a very, very, very short plateau. I suspect coal is now at the end of its plateau, about to collapse in demand. We'll start to see a lot of stranded assets as a result coming through. Oil a little bit longer, gas a little bit longer, but just one after the other have a very, very clear pattern. So let me draw to a conclusion with some thoughts on the wider implications of this shift. Of course, a finance background, so I'm going to try and inject a little bit of financial consequences into this narrative now. So the good news is that the goals of the Paris Agreement are actually still feasible. This is the pivot decade and a 300-year story of the growth, the very rapid growth, and then the equally rapid decline of the fossil fuel system. If you step out long enough, you always see a kind of very, very clear pattern of change. But Paris does actually become feasible if we allow the growth to continue. It means that the race to the top is on fire. The future is becoming increasingly clear. Most countries will therefore pivot, and that means faster change. It's worthwhile noting here that if the US decides in November to pull out of the race for 4 years, it is a tragedy for the US, but the transition itself will continue because there are many other countries which are still doing it. It means the global south will continue to leapfrog to local, cheaper, cleaner technologies. From Namibia to Morocco, from Vietnam to Kenya, this clean tech revolution opens up the space for growth and development. It's an extraordinary tool of justice for those folks with very low levels of energy usage today. It means we're at peak waste from the polluting fossil fuel system. That gives us a chance to reduce the massive pressure on nature. And then we're halfway through a capital reallocation from fossil fuels to clean tech. It's worth noting that capital availability, again, is no impediment to the energy transition. You simply shift your deployment of capital from the dying fossil system to the growing clean tech system, and net, your growth in capital is really quite limited. A point that needs to be noted by the many consultants who have added up the numbers and got it completely wrong because they're comparing apples with pears, mentioning no names. The fossil fuel system therefore faces trillions of dollars in stranded assets. We have a $50 trillion fossil fuel fixed asset system. They're building for growth, but they're about to face catastrophic decline. The gap, ladies and gentlemen, is stranded assets. There's huge amounts of stranded assets coming down the pipe, certainly by the end of this decade and in the 2030s. It means we need to change our framework of reference to China, not just because China's got the lowest costs and a credible government plan, but also because it's got the majority of clean tech deployment. So focus less on the problems we face in our own nations and more on the solutions that are taking place in China and cascading out around the rest of Asia. And then the debate will be very, very different in 2030. I guess this is the key point we bring to the debate as financial analysts. Remember how far we've come since 2015 in terms of the fall in costs of renewables, and then think through where we're heading. So by 2030, we'll have super cheap renewables and batteries. We'll have many more solutions. The fossil fuel peak will be behind us. The race to the top will be in earnest. So I would suggest that by 2030, this story will be priced into markets. That means a Minsky moment is coming for the banking sector as they shift from denial and greenwashing to actually trying to reduce their exposure to this risk. Final section. What do we need to do now? So the first point is that the 2020s are the pivot decade. This is not some kind of highfalutin 2050 story. This is the decade that the manufacturing capacity gets built, that clean tech production goes up the steep part of the S curve, that costs get too cheap to resist, that the fossil fuel sector enters into terminal decline. So kind of blink and you've missed it. We should focus on the signal, not the noise. We should model the new, not the old, and think much less about all of the fossil fuel advertisements about EV demand supposedly falling or AI centers creating demand for gas, and more about the reality of exponential clean tech growth upending a stagnant, moribund system. We should build, baby, build. We need to build out this clean tech system. We need to build it out as quickly as possible. That means a radical change in the permitting regimes, pricing structures, regulation. Again, Chinese can do this stuff. We need to figure out how to do it as well. We've got to improve the way we approach these issues. It's a policy issue now. It's no longer a technology or economics issue. We need to speed up electrification in the OECD. It's absolutely shameful that electricity as a share of final energy demand has been stagnant for 10 or 15 years in the OECD. We need to figure out how to change that. Again, we don't need to look far. China's actually doing this stuff. We need to be electrifying all of our end uses, and we need proper plans to do so. We need to be making good bets on the technologies of the future. That is to say, taking this the Schmidt framing. We need to focus on the standardized modular technologies that work, rather than allocating our scarce resources to unproven bets like nuclear or BECCS or the stuff at the top right end of the solution suite. We need to be harvesting the vast fields of efficiency. If I may channel the brilliant work of Amory Lovins for 40 years, it's all about efficiency, folks. Efficiency is 100 times bigger as a solution than carbon capture. So that's what we need to be doing. Not to say we shouldn't have a few boffins working out how to do some carbon capture for 2052. But today, in the 2020s, it's all about efficiency. That's where you're going to get massive returns and massive reductions in carbon pollution. Companies, meanwhile, need to move from, as it were, tactics to strategy. It's time to ditch all these ESG scores and carbon offsetting, all this stuff. You've got to rethink your business model for a new energy system if you're a major fossil fuel user or producer. In the financial sector, investors need to move. We need to reallocate capital out of the dying fossil fuel sector and make good bets on the companies leading the clean tech revolution. Of course, it ain't easy, but that's what you get paid for, I guess. Modelers need to up their game. It really is quite boring reading all of these fake models based on stagnant policy and stagnant technology and having to debunk them month after month. Come on, folks. There is simply no point modeling stagnation anymore. Yesterday's debate is between stagnation and low growth. Today's debate is between low growth and rapid growth. And tomorrow's debate, the 2030 debate, is between rapid growth and very rapid growth. It really is time for the modeling community to up its game a bit. So let me conclude. We are in a race. This is a call, as it were, to urgency. I'm using Tim Lenton's framing at Exeter and his very brilliant analysis of how climate tipping points are getting closer and closer. It's a race against time. Can we activate this clean tech revolution fast enough to avoid climate catastrophe? So we absolutely have agency. There's a reason to work night and day to get the job done, because it's a race. So the direction of change may be, or is, I would suggest, inevitable, but the speed is certainly up to us. I'm going to conclude here, hand back to Sam, but I will urge all of you to go out there and make the change happen.